The dark, icy water of the vast river seemed like ink, dissolving even the light of the sparse stars. It was the deep night of late September 1943. On the left, low bank of the Dnieper, an unnatural commotion reigned, concealed by fog and fear. Thousands of people, gasping from exertion, dragged everything that could stay afloat to the water. Empty fuel barrels, wooden gates unhinged from nearby burned villages, bundles of dry straw tied with soldiers' belts, and car tires. There was a grinding sound, quiet curses, and the heavy breathing of a massive crowd of people who understood that in an hour, many of them would cease to exist. Before them lay a water barrier almost a kilometer wide, and on the other bank, on high, almost sheer cliffs, the enemy lurked, having turned the right bank into an impregnable fortress. The air was permeated with the smell of dampness, shag tobacco, and impending disaster. This was not a planned crossing with prepared pontoons and engineering calculations. It was a desperate surge dictated by a will that brooked no delay. Every soldier entering this autumn water knew that the Dnieper could become his last frontier, but the force of the order drove them forward into the cold unknown. To understand how millions of people found themselves in this icy trap, one must rewind the tape of time a little to the completion of the Battle of Kursk. After the backbone of the German offensive was broken in the summer of 1943, the strategic initiative finally passed to the Red Army. The German command, realizing that it was no longer possible to hold the steppe expanses of left bank Ukraine, decided on a large-scale retreat. This was not a panicked flight. It was an organized, cynical, and cruel withdrawal behind a life-saving water barrier. German generals called this line the Eastern Wall, a grandiose system of fortifications that was supposed to stop the Soviet steamroller. The Dnieper, the third largest river in Europe, with its high right bank dominating the low left, was ideally suited for this purpose. In Berlin, it was believed that the Dnieper would become the wall against which Russian armies would break, and where the war would enter a positional stage, allowing them to gather strength. The German tactic of scorched earth during their retreat left behind only ashes. Railroads were destroyed with special plows, wells were poisoned, livestock was driven away, and the able-bodied population was forcibly sent west. Soviet troops, pursuing the retreating enemy, moved through territory that had been flourishing just yesterday, but today resembled a lunar landscape. The pace of the offensive was frantic. The Supreme High Command in Moscow understood. If the enemy was allowed to consolidate on the right bank, if the Germans were allowed to bring up reserves and thicken their defenses on the eastern wall, the war could drag on for years. A categorical order was given: to reach the Dnieper on the heels of the retreating enemy and to force the river on the fly without waiting for heavy rear support and pontoon parks. This decision contained both brilliant strategic audacity and a monstrous tragedy, the price of which thousands of ordinary soldiers would have to pay. By mid-September, advanced units of the Red Army reached the river on a front stretching over 700 kilometers. The sight that greeted them was majestic and terrifying. A wide expanse of water, calm and indifferent, separated two worlds. On the other bank, on the chalk cliffs, machine gun nests had already been set up, tanks dug into the ground, and artillery batteries positioned. The Germans had managed to blow up all bridges. There were no crossings. Soviet tanks and artillery stopped at the water's edge, unable to support the infantry with direct fire. But the order demanded immediate advance. A paradoxical situation arose. The most powerful army in the world, saturated with technology, found itself before a water barrier in the state of primitive warriors, forced to rely only on physical strength and improvised means. It is here that the first layer of this grandiose drama begins, the layer of visible, physical confrontation between man and the elements, intensified by enemy fire. Regimental and divisional commanders, having received harsh directives to take the bridgehead at all costs, found themselves in a situation of impossible choice. Waiting for standard crossing equipment meant giving the Germans time to strengthen even further and, possibly, facing accusations of cowardice or sabotage. Beginning the crossing with improvised means meant sending men into a deadly barrage without heavy support. The choice was made in favor of speed. One of the most massive improvisations in military history began. Soldiers dismantled sheds, tied rafts from logs, stuffed raincoats with hay. Fishing boats, miraculously preserved by local residents, became strategic transport. The first groups of daredevils pushed off into the darkness. As soon as oars or poles touched the water, the silence was shattered. German flares, hanging in the sky on small parachutes, flooded the river with a deathly pale light, turning night into day. The river boiled from bursting mines and shells. The water around the rafts turned dark. Those who could not swim, and there were many such among the reinforcements from the steppe regions, panicked and clung to debris, dragging comrades to the bottom. Machine guns from the right bank fired incessantly, tearing through the flimsy wooden structures. But the stream of boats and rafts did not dry up. If the first wave disappeared into the water, a second, then a third, followed. It was like an assembly line working at the limit of human capabilities. Those who managed to reach the narrow strip of sand under the steep bank dug into the ground with their teeth and shovels, creating tiny islands of Soviet territory. But behind this visible picture of a heroic assault lay a second, far more tragic and personal layer of conflict. This was the tragedy of the so-called Black Infantry, or Chernoshvitochniki. As Ukrainian villages and cities were liberated, field military commissariats immediately mobilized the local male population who had been under occupation. These men, often exhausted by 2 years of life under the Germans, had no time to be trained or even to change into military uniforms. They were not issued dog tags. Their names were often not entered into personnel lists until the first battle. They went into attack in their civilian jackets, padded jackets and homespun coats, hence this terrible name. Many of them received weapons only on the bank, and sometimes they were told to obtain weapons in battle. For career officers who had been through Stalingrad and Kursk, these men were often a gray area. They had lived under the enemy, and their loyalty required proof by blood. For the mobilized themselves, it was a chance to atone for being under occupation, though there was no guilt on their part. They were thrown into the most difficult sectors. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian peasants and townspeople entered the waters of the Dnieper in their civilian clothes, never to emerge on the other bank. Their bodies, swollen with water, were then carried downstream for a long time, towards the Black Sea. In official reports, they often appeared as missing in action, because lists were compiled chaotically or lost along with clerks during bombings. The personal tragedy of these people, thrown into the crucible of war without preparation, remains one of the most painful and silenced pages of the Battle of the Dnieper. Mid-level commanders, captains, majors, colonels, were also caught in the throes of internal conflict. Seeing their battalions melt away, trying to seize and hold scraps of land on the right bank, they were forced time and again to send men to certain death. Radios crackled with demands from army and front headquarters, Expand the bridgehead! Not a step back! The officers knew that without heavy equipment, which was still on the left bank, the infantry was doomed to be ground down. But an order is an order. The psychological stress was off the charts. Many commanders themselves went into attack in the first ranks, preferring to share the fate of their soldiers rather than sending them to slaughter from a safe dugout. The third layer of this colossal clash was ideological, philosophical. Here, two totalitarian systems collided, two concepts of the attitude towards human resources and goals. For Nazi Germany, the Eastern Wall was the last hope for maintaining superpower status capable of dictating terms. Holding the Dnieper was a matter of prestige and the survival of the Reich. Hitler declared that the Dnieper would sooner flow backward than the Russians would take it. For the Soviet Union, the crossing of the Dnieper became a symbol of the inevitability of retribution and liberation. But here, too, the terrible paradox of the Soviet system manifested itself. The end justifies the means, even if those means are hundreds of thousands of human lives. The political factor played a special role in this drama. The date of November 7th was approaching, the anniversary of the October Revolution. In the Soviet tradition, it was customary to present the leader and the people with gifts for festive dates in the form of captured cities and won battles. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was to be liberated specifically by this day. This desire of the highest political leadership created enormous pressure on military planning. Strategic expediency was replaced by political necessity. Instead of carefully preparing the operation, accumulating forces and striking where the enemy was weaker, troops were rushed forward to meet the deadline. This calendar fetishism cost the lives of a huge number of people who could have survived with a more systematic approach. Events unfolded simultaneously in several directions. Soviet troops captured more than 20 bridgeheads on the right bank, but most of them were tiny, bullet-swept patches of land where one couldn't even raise their head. The main attention was focused on two bridgeheads in the Kiev area: Bukrinsky, located south of the city, and Lyutezhsky, located north. The command's initial plan envisioned the main strike from the Bukrinsky bridgehead. The terrain there was extremely difficult, hills cut by ravines, where tanks had difficulty maneuvering. But it was there that the main forces were concentrated, including the Guards tank army. The Germans, having deciphered the plan, pulled their best divisions to Bukrin. A meat grinder began. Soviet troops repeatedly tried to break through the defenses, but ran into intense anti-tank artillery fire and counterattacks from SS Tank Corps. The ground on the Bukrin bridgehead was so churned up by shells that not a single living tree remained. The hills turned into a mixture of earth, metal, and human bodies. Days turned into weeks, but there was no breakthrough. Losses grew exponentially. It seemed that the offensive had stalled and catastrophe was imminent. The High Command demanded results, but banging their heads against the wall of Bukrin was becoming pointless. And then comes the moment of transformation, a turning point in the entire battle, which demonstrates the flexibility and cunning of Soviet commanders, capable of learning from their mistakes right in the course of the battle. Understanding the futility of further attacks in the south, Front Commander Vatutin, together with Stavka Representative Zhukov, makes a daring decision. It is necessary to secretly transfer an entire tank army from the Bukrin bridgehead to the Lyutezh bridgehead. This meant that hundreds of tanks, thousands of guns, and tens of thousands of soldiers had to imperceptibly cross back to the left bank, make a forced march north along the front, and then cross back to the right bank in the Lyutezh area. And all this right under the noses of German aviation and intelligence. This operation became a masterpiece of military camouflage. Tanks and trucks moved only at night with headlights off. During the day, equipment was hidden in forests and ravines, carefully camouflaged with branches and nets. Mock-ups of tanks and guns remained on the Bukhrin bridgehead. Radio stations continued active radio exchanges, simulating preparations for a new offensive. Sound broadcasting installations transmitted the noise of engines and the clanking of tracks. The Germans believed it. They continued to hold their main reserves in the south, expecting a blow from there, while the steel fist of the Red Army was already clenching in the north, over the Lyutezh bridgehead, which hung over Kiev. By the beginning of November, the regrouping was complete. On the morning of November 3, 1943, the earth trembled. From the Lyutezh bridgehead, artillery of such density struck that German fortifications were literally wiped off the face of the earth. After a powerful artillery preparation, tanks and infantry went into battle. For the German command, this was a complete shock. The defense in the northern sector, weakened by the transfer of reserves to the south, cracked and crumbled. Soviet tanks broke into operational space and rushed towards Kiev, bypassing the city from the west and cutting off the escape routes for the German garrison. On the night of November 6th, fighting was already taking place on the streets of the Ukrainian capital. Tank crews, including those of the Czechoslovak Corps, fighting shoulder to shoulder with Soviet soldiers, broke through to the city center. Burning buildings illuminated their path. The Germans, fearing encirclement, began a panicked retreat. By the morning of November 6th, Kiev was completely cleared of the enemy. Stalin's order was fulfilled. The city was taken just in time for the holiday. Moscow saluted the liberators with 24 salvos from 324 guns. It was a triumph heralded by all the newspapers of the world. The myth of the impregnability of the Eastern Wall was finally shattered. But when the smoke of battle cleared and the fanfare subsided, the terrible price of this success was laid bare. The resonance of the Battle of the Dnieper echoes through the decades, not with triumphant marches, but with the quiet weeping for the fallen. The losses of the Red Army during the Battle of the Dnieper are estimated by various historians from 400,000 to 1 million people, including sanitary and irrecoverable losses. The water in the river, according to eyewitnesses, remained brownish for a long time. In the lower reaches of the Dnieper, fishermen for years pulled out terrible fines. For Ukraine, this battle became not just a military episode, but a national trauma and a feat simultaneously. Practically every Ukrainian family has someone who remained there, at the crossings, or in the cold trenches on the right bank. The lessons of this battle are multifaceted and contradictory. On the one hand, it showed an incredible strength of spirit, the human capacity for self-sacrifice for the liberation of their native land. It demonstrated the increased skill of Soviet generals, capable of conducting complex strategic maneuvers. On the other hand, the Battle of the Dnieper will forever remain a monument to the ruthlessness of a system for which people were merely expendable material, fuel for the locomotive of history. Take at any cost. This phrase became a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of sons, fathers, and husbands. Today, studying these events, we must see not only arrows on maps, but also the faces of those Chernoshvitniki, black-tunicked ones, who went into the icy water without rifles, armed only with hope and despair. The paradox of the victory on the Dnieper is that it combines the highest heroism and the deepest tragedy, strategic genius and tactical helplessness, state triumph and personal grief. We have no right to judge those who gave orders from the warm comfort of modernity, but we are obliged to remember the price that was paid. To forget this price means to betray those who remained lying at the bottom of the great river. In the finale, we return once more to the image of the river. The Dnieper flows, as it did thousands of years ago, wide, mighty, and indifferent. Its waters have concealed the traces of that terrible autumn, washed away the blood, and carried off the debris of rafts. But if one stands on the high, steep bank at dawn, when the fog spreads over the water, one can feel the cold breath of history. The silence over the river is deceptive. It is filled with the voices of those who once stepped into that abyss to build a bridge to the future with their bodies. The river keeps its secrets, but the memory of people must be deeper than the riverbed. The battle for the right bank ended in victory, but the echo of this battle, mingled with the lapping of the Dnieper's waves, will sound forever, reminding us how thin the line is between grandeur and horror, between life and eternity. This is a reminder to all of us of the fragility of the world, and that behind every line in a history textbook stand living people whose hearts stopped beating so that the history of humanity might continue.